If you could please indulge me for just 1 second. I want you to think about your cell phone. What a marvelous piece of technology that is there. Instant connection with the world. Enormous computing power in your hand. And that technology is something that we take for granted every day. Unlike a CEO of a technology company, as a judge, I sit in a system that has evolved very little in these last 100, 200 years. And that failure to evolve is crippling our children and the communities they live in. Now, I remember when I was 16. I think I was 16, but yeah. And at that point, I was invincible. I knew everything. No one could tell me anything. Any of you kind of recall with that? Yeah, right? You know, that can you think of the things that you did wrong, that you didn't get caught at, that were you to tell the person you were with today, you'd be completely embarrassed by, right? You know, youth of every background and culture go through this same process of hormones, bravado, resistance to authority. I forgot to mention I was very resistant to authority. And stupidity. And the problem is, though, when youth of color engage in these behaviors that their future self would be embarrassed by, they often find the opportunity to then come to meet with me, Mr. Criminal Justice System. And when they meet me, I oftentimes change their lives utterly and irreversibly. I've watched this happen in our system, and that's why I'm now talking to you about restorative principles. You see, because I'm tired of a system that is engaged in a continuous punitive measures model. Especially when that information, the reality is those punitive measures just pull them deeper into our system. I mean, we as a society and a community, shouldn't our responsibility be about how to let them become that tax-paying, law-abiding citizen and not be so terribly harmed by their actions? We certainly don't want them to harm themselves or other in that process. Now we get to the point, you know, I keep on looking at a world that I want to see where our community is engaged in a collaborative model of engaging our youth and resolving this conflict, where we have shifted from this punitive model to a strength-based model, where we are actually listening to our youth and their voice to determine what the intervention should look like. Where detention is something that is rarely used, except in the most serious or extreme cases, where the science of adolescent brain development drives our interventions, so we can find that greater person. Now, my belief is restorative principles can bring that vision to light. Now, what is restorative principles? Well, it talks about accountability. The person who has engaged in the action needs to be held accountable. Acknowledge the act and be held accountable. It talks about the person who is harmed, the victim, is made whole, not just financially, but also emotionally and spiritually. And finally, it talks about the community, leveraging the resources of the community to create a better outcome where they embrace both the person who is harmed and the person who did the harm, because there's a better way forward in that way. Now, you may have heard of a recent case that we had in our court, and that employed the restorative principles process. We had a young man who decided he wanted to take the property of someone else, and it was by threat of force, shoes, and phone. Our normal process would have resulted in this young person being incarcerated for a period of 2 to 2.5 years in juvenile prison at a cost of over $200,000 of taxpayers' money. But we tried something different. We allowed him to participate in a restorative principles model called peacemaking circles. After 10 months, hundreds of hours from that young man, and thousands of hours from our community, he was able to create a support system around him that created a vision of him being that law-abiding, contributing member of our society. Now, this is not a soft on crime model or hug a thug model. But rather, this is a more holistic way to deal with the person harmed, the victim, and that youth, and the community. Because that person, that young man, has to get his respect back in the eyes of the community as well. This is a way so we can come up with, instead of always lose-lose situations, maybe a win-win situation. This is a paradigm shift because we incarcerate people. We think incarceration is the answer. United States, 5% of the world's population, incarcerates 25% of the incarceration population in the world. Yeah, that is stark numbers. But this is a process by which we are embracing, the community is embracing all of the players to come up with different outcomes. You know, the reality is the outcomes of our criminal justice system have been devastating on communities of color. And even our schools are engaging in a model that is having this disproportionate impact on youth of color. They are being expelled and suspended from schools disproportionately. And this really leads into the conversation of what about institutional racism. Because as a youth of color, you are 7 times more likely to have your case presented to the legal system than a white youth. You are 5 times more likely to have your case formally charges filed against you than a white youth. And after you go through the process, and if you are indeed found guilty, you are 11 times more likely to find yourself locked up in secure detention. Now, secure detention is a place where 85% of the population are youth of color. And of course, they only represent 35% of the general population. Now, you might say, Wesley, really, institutional racism? Yeah, my response is, well, you know, I know judges, I know police officers, I know probation officers, defense attorneys, and none of them are overtly racist. They don't call me the N-word in my courtroom, at least, to my face. But I'm looking at the numbers. And the numbers tell me that youth of color, people of color, are brought into our system and incarcerated at massively disproportionate rates. And there's something wrong there. So my belief is that I would encourage you, there's Professor Alexander, Michelle Alexander wrote the book, The New Jim Crow. If you haven't read it, I would encourage you to do so. She notes that institutional racism has had these devastating effects in our communities of color. And she notes, when you eliminate generations, and that's a plural, generations of leaders from the community, then black and brown youth have no role models on which to base their behavior. Now, restorative principles works. We have some examples because it uplifts the individual. It reestablishes a sense of respect by the community toward the individual and restores the individual's personal worth. New Zealand, in the country of New Zealand, first, it takes a lot of energy and effort to make a system change that pushes us this direction. New Zealand has been operating restorative principle programs since 1989. And the interesting thing is that in the course of that, today, 80% of the cases that used to be presented to their youth court are now resolved by way of diversion, police diversion, community diversions with supportive evidence-based programs behind it. And 80% of those cases that successfully complete that diversionary action never come back to court again. Impressive. Now, the 20% of cases that actually come to court, these are typically very serious cases, very complex issues involved in them. 60% of those cases who successfully participate in the family group conferencing, which is the restorative principle model, never come back to court. So this works. You know, we have to be courageous in stepping forward as a systems, as community, to do everything we can because what we've been doing, I'm sorry, that's not working so good. Now, the interesting thing is the programs that New Zealand is using are, the evidence-based programs are Washington State validated programs. So these are things that we know how to do. We just have to restructure ourselves so that we can do them effectively. You know, but this is larger than just a justice issue. And that's why I use the term restorative principles. Because when you use restorative justice, they say, oh, that's a court issue. We don't have to deal with this. But the issue, the reality of institutional racism is evident everywhere. Schools, behavioral health, housing, employment. You name the sector of our community, and there are manifestations of institutional racism. See, and my belief is that by carefully implementing programs based upon restorative principles, we can start dismantling that process and create new relationships that our community would benefit from, our world would actually benefit from. You know, I've been a judge now for 30 years, and before that, 10 years as an attorney. And this is the most hopeful criminal justice reform that I've ever seen. You know, but I got to be honest with you. I was a skeptical and reluctant participant in this program. Absolutely. Are you kidding me? I'm not going to do that. But you know, I began to trust the process and to believe in the process. And I felt personal transformation occurring. You know, and as I watched this young man mature and become this caring, empathetic, contributing member of our society, I was struck by what's possible with commitment and focus. The reality is jail is not an effective change agent for youth. And I'm here to bear witness to an institution that is ripe for change because our kids, our families, our communities, and our future deserve better. Thank you.